Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of love, loss, and personal growth. Today's story is about Emily, a pediatrician whose life is turned upside down after a heartbreaking miscarriage. As she navigates the complexities of family, judgment, and healing, Emily must confront her past and decide whether to offer forgiveness to those who have hurt her the most. It's a story of resilience, change, and the courage to rebuild what was once broken. Join us as we dive into her journey and the profound lessons she learns along the way. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin the story today. It was another crisp November morning in Chicago, the city's skyline barely visible through the blanket of mist that crept in from Lake Michigan. The faint rustle of falling leaves from the nearby trees added to the quiet serenity of the moment. From my office window, I watched as the hospital parking lot gradually filled with cars, an early indication that the day had begun. That life was continuing in its routine pace. As a pediatrician, I had grown accustomed to this morning ritual over the years. It was familiar, comforting even, but lately, everything felt different. I reached for the picture frame on my desk, my fingers brushing against the glass that encased the photo from my wedding day. David and I both smiling, radiating a sense of hope that seemed so far away now. Our wedding had been a celebration of love, of new beginnings. David, the man I had always leaned on, had been my support through everything. A successful corporate attorney, he was the steady force in our life together. And when I placed my hand on my abdomen, I couldn't help but think of the life we had dreamed of, the child we had dreamed of. 5 months ago, we had lost that dream. It had come suddenly, unexpectedly. One moment, I was feeling the usual excitement of being pregnant. The next, it all came crashing down. A sudden, sharp pain, and then the long night at the hospital. The doctor's apologetic expression, his gentle words telling me the heartbreaking news. "There's nothing more we can do," he had said. Those words still echoed in my mind. I had failed. We had failed. The knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. "The first patient is ready," the nurse's voice called. I took a deep breath and forced a smile. This was my coping mechanism, immerse myself in work. There would be time for healing later. I told myself, once David returned home, we would be able to find solace in each other's arms, as we had always done. But that day, something felt heavier than usual. The phone rang. I picked it up, immediately recognizing the voice on the other end. It was my mother, Deborah. "Emily." Her voice sounded more clipped than usual. "I just wanted to confirm the details for Thanksgiving. I've invited David's mother as well. It's the first time I'll be meeting her, and I want everything to be perfect." I paused, trying to digest her words. "You invited David's mother?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "Yes, of course," Deborah replied, her tone still carrying that polished air of superiority she was known for. "She's part of our family. Especially after, well, you know, after everything." The everything she referred to was, of course, the miscarriage. I hated the way she talked about it, so clinical, so detached, as if it were just an unfortunate incident, a blemish on the family reputation. I sighed, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Yes, Eleanor is truly a wonderful person," I said, trying to keep the conversation polite. Eleanor was David's mother, and unlike my own family, she had shown me nothing but kindness and compassion during the darkest days of my life. She had been there for me, holding my hand when I could barely keep it together. "And what about Victoria and Tom?" Deborah asked, shifting the conversation back to the family. Victoria, my sister, was the golden child in our family, everything I wasn't. A stay-at-home mom. A perfect mother to her 3-year-old son, Timothy. "Victoria and Tom are coming too. With little Timothy," Deborah continued, her voice swelling with pride. "You know how perfect she is. Always the model mother." I clenched my jaw, the familiar pang of resentment rising up inside me. Victoria had always been the one to get everything right, the one to be adored. I, on the other hand, had been criticized for prioritizing my medical career over starting a family at the right time. My mother had never understood my choices. And now, after the miscarriage, I was left feeling like a failure in their eyes. "How's Dad?" I asked, trying to shift the focus away from Victoria and her perfect life. "Your father is the same," Deborah replied, a hint of irritation in her voice. "He's locked away in his study. As usual, doesn't want to be disturbed." I could almost hear the exasperation in her words. Dad had always been more passive in the family, content to retreat into his books and research, avoiding the family's tensions. After the call ended, I sat at my desk, staring out the window. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for family, for togetherness, but this year, it felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. I should have been 7 months pregnant by now. I should have been celebrating with my family, feeling the baby kick inside me, basking in the joy of new life. Instead, I was still mourning the child I would never hold. I took out my phone and sent a message to David. "Mom invited Eleanor for Thanksgiving. Is that okay?" His response came almost immediately. "Of course. We're a team. We'll get through this together." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief. David had been my rock through everything. He was always there, always understanding. And so was Eleanor. The next day, as I sat with David in the living room, the weight of Thanksgiving loomed over us. I couldn't help but wonder why my mother had suddenly invited Eleanor. The two had never really gotten along, and the timing seemed odd. "I wonder why Mom suddenly invited Eleanor," I mused aloud, trying to make sense of it all. David shrugged, his eyes warm. "She's probably just pleased. She's been wanting to meet your family for a while now. But you know how Thanksgiving can be," he added, a knowing look in his eyes. "Family gatherings can sometimes be tense." "I know," I replied quietly, "especially with Mom and Victoria. They don't really understand what I've been through." David squeezed my hand, offering a silent promise of support. "It'll be fine," he said. "My mom's on our side too. We'll make it through together." But even as he spoke those comforting words, I couldn't shake the anxiety that gnawed at my insides. How would they look at me now? Would they see me as the woman who failed? Would they judge me for losing a child before I even had the chance to be a mother? That night, after we finished dinner, I received a message from Eleanor asking if I wanted to grab lunch the next day. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Eleanor had always known when I needed her. We met at a small cafe in the city, and as she greeted me with her warm smile, I immediately felt the comfort of her presence. "Thank you for inviting me to Thanksgiving," Eleanor said, her voice gentle. "Your mother was very kind on the phone." I laughed softly. That's Mom's social voice. She's desperate to maintain her reputation as the perfect hostess. Eleanor's smile softened. "Are you okay? Thanksgiving can be emotional, especially this year." I took a deep breath, considering her question. "To be honest, I'm a bit nervous. Mom and Victoria aren't really sympathetic about what happened. For them, it's almost like, well, they think I brought it upon myself." "Nonsense," Eleanor said firmly. "You're a wonderful doctor, and one day you'll be a wonderful mother. Timing and methods don't matter. What matters is love." Her words, simple but profound, broke something inside me. Tears welled up in my eyes. This was what I needed to hear. Love, unconditional support, understanding. As I wiped my tears away, Eleanor took my hand in hers. And for the first time in months, I felt like everything might be okay. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and the cold air of Chicago felt even more biting than usual. David and I dressed in our finest, trying to put on a brave face for the family gathering that awaited us at the Mitchells' home. When we arrived at the large, perfectly manicured house, the door swung open to reveal Deborah, standing in the doorway with a flawless smile and perfectly styled hair, as if she were the very embodiment of grace. "Emily, David, you're late," she said with a slight hint of annoyance, her eyes lingering a moment too long on David, as though he were a guest of the highest importance. The underlying message was clear. This dinner had to be perfect. And punctuality was key. Inside, Victoria was already busy playing with Timothy, her 3-year-old son. In the living room, her smile was radiant, Her appearance flawless, just as it always was. She seemed to have it all. The perfect life. The perfect family. And me? Well, I was the one who always seemed to fall short. I asked about Eleanor almost immediately. It was hard for me to mask my concern after all that had transpired. Is Eleanor here yet? I asked, keeping my voice casual, though my heart was racing. Yes, of course. She arrived on time, Deborah said with a hint of sarcasm. A subtle jab at me. Though I don't think she realized it. It wasn't unusual for my mother to dismiss the things that mattered most to me. Especially when they came from someone outside of our immediate family. As we entered the living room, I could feel the tension building in my chest. Eleanor stood up to greet us. Her warm smile reaching out to embrace us as if we were long-lost friends. She had clearly been playing on the floor with Timothy, her laughter ringing in the air, and it was hard not to feel a pang of jealousy at the ease with which she seemed to connect with my family. She hugged both David and me, and the warmth of her embrace made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. It's been a while, Victoria said as she picked up her son. You look good. Have you gained weight? Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I forced a smile, feeling my cheeks flush as I tried to mask my discomfort. Work has been busy, I answered. I haven't had time to exercise. David squeezed my hand, sensing the tension that had begun to seep into my body. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in this perfect family facade that was anything but perfect. At that moment, my father emerged from his study. Thomas, my retired professor father, was the calm in the storm of my family. He was always hidden behind a veil of scholarly pursuits, avoiding the chaos that often swirled around us. He was quiet, gentle, and for the most part, passive, but when he greeted me with a soft embrace, I could see the genuine warmth in his eyes. The only warmth I had felt all evening. As we all sat down to dinner, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that raged within me. The dining room was beautifully decorated, with a crystal chandelier overhead and the rich smell of turkey filling the air. Everything looked perfect, just as my mother had planned it to be. But I couldn't ignore the coldness that hung in the air, the subtle barbs. The meaningless exchanges of glances. The quiet criticisms that passed between Victoria and Deborah. Their words were disguised as casual remarks. But they stung just the same. I could feel it in the way my mother looked at me. Emily, Deborah said, offering me a slice of turkey. Have you gained weight recently? You're not pregnant anymore. You know, you should be careful. The room fell into an awkward silence. I felt my stomach tighten as David's hand squeezed my thigh beneath the table. His silent support a balm to the raw wound my mother had just reopened. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, and I could feel her trying to hold back her anger. But it was clear that she was deeply offended by my mother's words. My father, too, seemed uneasy, his hand resting on his forehead as though trying to shield himself from the discomfort that filled the room. Victoria giggled nervously, brushing her son's hair as she tried to change the subject. Timothy's already preparing for kindergarten. His teacher says he's extremely intelligent. He must take after Grandpa Thomas. But it wasn't enough to cover the tension. I could feel my hands trembling, my breath shallow. I struggled to keep my composure. But inside, everything was unraveling. That was when Deborah decided to dig even deeper. Are you and David trying for another child? She asked. Her tone casual, but her words felt like a punch in the gut. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the color drain from my face. Mom, that's a private matter between David and me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the sting of her question lingered. I know, she said dismissively, but as family, I worry. You're already 35. Time is ticking away. Eleanor's voice cut through the growing tension. Elizabeth, that's a bit much, she said quietly, her tone firm but controlled. Deborah waved her hand as though to dismiss Eleanor's concern. As the mother of an only son, you might understand, she said, her words trailing off into another round of awkward silence. But she didn't stop there. Her voice softened, as though she were letting something slip that she hadn't meant to reveal. I've been thinking about your incident, Emily, she said, The word, incident, dripping with disdain. As a doctor, you should have understood the risks. Long hours, stress, and well, your age. Please, not now, I whispered, feeling the walls of the room close in on me. But she pressed on. In a way, your miscarriage might have been a blessing for the family, she said with a thin smile. We've been spared a defective addition to the family. Her words pierced me like a knife. And worse yet, I saw the relatives around the table laugh awkwardly, as though they were complicit in her cruelty. I felt my hands shake as I gripped my fork, my mind spiraling into a world of disbelief and hurt. I had already lost my child, my hope, my future, and now, my very identity as a woman and a mother was being questioned. Slowly, I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent as I stared at my mother. David stood too, his hand placed firmly on my shoulder, his eyes cold as he glared at my mother. Elizabeth, either you take back what you just said, or we're leaving, he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury that I had never heard before. My mother looked surprised, but I could see the slightest flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had never seen David so resolute. Well, I merely spoke the truth, she said, her voice wavering slightly, but still tinged with pride. That's not the truth, David countered, his voice sharpening. It's cruelty. Eleanor stood, her voice calm but filled with strength. I didn't expect Thanksgiving at this house to be so cold, she said quietly, her words like a dagger in the silence. Victoria, of course, had to intervene. Please, everyone's overreacting, she said, her tone dismissive. Mom is just concerned. But for the first time in my life, I couldn't hold back the truth any longer. For 2 years, David and I wanted a child, I said, my voice trembling but steady. The day I miscarried, I felt like I had failed. As a doctor, as a woman, as a potential mother. But now, I realize it wasn't me who failed. It was you. You failed to show love, to show support. You failed to understand. Deborah opened her mouth, but I raised my hand, silencing her. The words you said tonight didn't just hurt me. They invalidated my experience. You mocked the life I lost. And I can't forgive you for that. Tears filled my eyes, but I stood firm. David stood beside me, Eleanor beside him. Together, we walked out of the room, leaving behind the people who were supposed to be my family. The days following Thanksgiving were a blur, a mix of anger, disappointment, and quiet reflection. It wasn't until late the next evening, when David and I sat together in the soft glow of our living room, that I was finally able to process the events of the previous night. I hadn't expected that level of cruelty from my mother. But what hurt even more was the way she had made me feel small, like my grief didn't matter. Like my experience of loss wasn't valid. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, my head resting against David's shoulder as I let the tears I had been holding back all day finally flow. I can't believe she said that, I whispered, my voice shaky with emotion. She made me feel like I wasn't even a real mother. Like losing my baby was something that could be brushed off. David held me tighter, his arms strong around me. She's wrong, Emily. You're a wonderful mother, and you didn't fail. It wasn't your fault. I know, I whispered back, trying to gather my strength. But it still hurts. How could she be so cold? How could she say those things? David's silence spoke volumes. He understood. He knew the pain I was carrying inside. And he wasn't about to minimize it or pretend it didn't exist. He just held me, the steady presence I needed in that moment. It was then that my phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Eleanor. How are you? Do you want to talk? I smiled softly at the message, knowing that Eleanor was always there for me, ready to listen, ready to support. I responded with a simple, I'm okay, just needed some time. The next day, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed my mother's name. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing. I wasn't sure I was ready to speak to her yet, but I couldn't ignore the call. Hello? I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily, My mother's voice sounded different this time, softer, more uncertain. I wanted to talk about last night. I closed my eyes, steeling myself for whatever was to come. I'm at work now, Mom, I said, my tone polite but firm. And what you said isn't easily forgotten. I'm not ready to talk to you yet. I need time. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. Her hesitation. All right, she finally said, her voice small, almost fragile. I understand, but I hope you know that I never meant to hurt you. I was just worried. I know, I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. But I can't just forget what was said. Mom, please give me time. With that, I ended the call and returned to my work. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. My mother's tone had been filled with regret. Something I hadn't expected. Maybe she hadn't realized just how deep her words had cut. Or perhaps it was a sign that she was beginning to understand. Slowly, the impact of her actions. Over the next few weeks, the situation continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. Deborah's world seemed to be crumbling around her, though she wasn't willing to admit it. Her company, Mitchell Boutique, had long struggled with legal issues, and it became clear that her disregard for the people around her, her employees, her family, was catching up with her. I didn't take any joy in her downfall, but I couldn't deny that it was happening. David, as a corporate attorney, had remained detached from the situation for the sake of family harmony. But after Thanksgiving, he made it clear that he could no longer turn a blind eye. He dove into the legal issues surrounding Mitchell Boutique, thoroughly investigating tax fraud and labor violations, determined to ensure that the law was upheld, no matter who it affected. David's efforts didn't go unnoticed. In fact, the impact of his work started to spread. Whistleblowers within the company had started coming forward, and the evidence of mismanagement became undeniable. As the investigation ramped up, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of liberation. The family I had once sought to please was unraveling because of their own actions. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. And then, one afternoon, David came home with an unexpected proposal. I've been thinking, he said, his voice hesitant but firm. What if we help her? I looked at him, confused. Help who? Your mom, he replied. We can help her get out of this mess, Emily, but there's a price to be paid. I leaned back against the couch, unsure where this conversation was going. What do you mean, a price? David continued. I'm talking about helping her company. We could offer to help restructure it, to take on the debt and manage the finances. But she and Victoria will need to make some serious changes. They'll have to show real accountability. They need to understand the impact of their words and actions. I thought about it for a moment. The idea of helping my mother, after everything that had happened, felt impossible, but something inside me shifted. Maybe this was the opportunity for real change. For both my mother and me. If we helped her, it would be a way for her to prove that she could change. That she could show genuine remorse for the way she had treated me and others. I'll think about it, I said quietly, finally beginning to understand what David was proposing. It wasn't just about saving her company. It was about saving what little was left of our relationship. It was about breaking the cycle of bitterness, of misunderstandings, and finally choosing healing over resentment. I didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was clear, it was time to take a step forward. A step toward rebuilding not just her company, but the fractured family that had once been my entire world. As the weeks passed, Emily's family began to change in ways that none of them had anticipated. Deborah and Victoria, reluctantly at first, accepted the terms David had set. They agreed to volunteer at a miscarriage support group for 1 year, giving them the opportunity to truly understand the pain they had once dismissed. Emily, with David by her side and Eleanor offering her steady support, began to heal in ways she had never thought possible. The following Christmas, the atmosphere in Emily's home was one of warmth and love. The tension that had once defined her family gatherings was gone. Deborah, once obsessed with perfection, now came bearing a humble homemade apple pie, a gesture that symbolized the change within her. She no longer wore the mask of perfection, she had learned to embrace imperfection. To open her heart to empathy and understanding. Family isn't about blood ties, Emily thought to herself as she watched her daughter's laughter fill the room. Her heart swelling with gratitude. It's about love, respect, and the courage to change. As they gathered around the table for their Christmas meal, Deborah spoke through tears. I've learned what it means to be a true family. It's about supporting each other through the hardest times. Not pretending everything is perfect. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for not seeing you. Emily, I've learned the power of words. And I will never take them lightly again. Emily smiled softly, her heart full. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time in years, she felt hopeful. Her family had finally found its way back to each other. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more life stories that remind us all of the power of love, change, and forgiveness.